Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you once again virtually to the University of Baltimore. My name is Nusta Karanzako, an assistant professor at the University of Baltimore. This conference has been made possible by the grant from the Academy of Korean Studies. Thank you for generously supporting our efforts. Today's conference is the second of a two-day conference that embarks on the theme and title of A New Outlook to Atrocities, Comfort Women, and What Remains. It is an interdisciplinary conference that examines the question of comfort women. As yesterday's presenters have shown us, there is much work that still remains to be done related to how to address victims' needs, victims' rights, where we go forward with memorialization, and the question of politicization of comfort women's atrocities and sufferings. These are all open questions that carry on to today's conference session and panel, and which we hope will spark new and great conversations about where we go next as academics, scholars, and activists. Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing Professor Mi-kyung Kim from Pugyong National University, who will be chairing this session. Please keep in mind that we will have the Q&A at the end of all the panelists' presentations, and for panelists to limit their presentations to 20 minutes. I will be keeping time via the Zoom chat, so please see the warning signs for 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute. Thank you very much.
Okay, it is my great pleasure and honor to chair the second day session of this important conference under the theme of A New Outlook to the Atrocities, Comfort Women, and What Remains. And as I have seen the schedule, the theme of today's session is centering the victim and what remains. As I understand it, yesterday, there were interesting paper presentations and discussions, and the topics covered yesterday included the power of Korean comfort women's testimonies, new genre, new audiences, retelling the story of Japan's military sexual slavery, the perils of apology, social media, and the memory of comfort women. As Professor Karanza just has mentioned, we are trying to venture into the investigated topics related to comfort women. And as I have seen the titles of yesterday's panel, I was very impressed by the advancement and new framing to better understand what the difficult past experienced by comfort women mean for us as academics and activists. As Professor Karanza has explained, each talk will be limited to 20 minutes, and we are going to have Q&A session after all the presentations are done. And without further ado, I'd like to have the honor of introducing Professor Na-young Lee at Chungang University. And the topic of her paper is Reconfiguring Activist Survivors of Japanese Military Sexual Slavery, Remapping Encounters Between Colonial Women. Professor Lee, would you please present your talk?
Okay, let me share my slide. So could you see that?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mi-kyung Kim, to introduce me to a participant. My name is Na-young Lee. I'm a professor of Department of Sociology at Chungang University, Seoul, South Korea. And also I'm in charge of the Korean Council since 2020, May 2020, actually. So I'm activist and also a scholar. Today's title of my presentation is, as Dr. Mi Kyung's introduction, Reconfiguring Activist Survivors of Japanese Sexual Slavery, Remapping Encounters Between Colonial Women. Before moving forward to the main presentation, I would like to introduce myself, my positionality. I have been trained in the academia, particularly in English literature and women's studies and sociology. A very, very interdisciplinary person, I think. And also I'm a feminist qualitative researcher, very familiar with textual analysis, historiography, ethnography, in-depth interviews, oral history, mixed method. My academic field include feminist theories, post-colonialism, androcentric nationalism, sexuality, queer theories, feminist movement, transnationalism, East Asia history. Currently, I'm delving into history denialism. Also, I have been involved in various activist areas. That's why I have a long relationship with victim survivors, activists, experts, lawyers, and scholars in feminist activist field. And my position is kind of in the spectrum of inside and outside of the activism and academia too. And my main topic I have been indulged into covered US military prostitution, sex tourism, prostitution, domestic prostitution, and transnational prostitution too, comfort women issue, of course, sexual violence, transnational movement, pornography, sexual exploitation, sexual minorities, etc. That's why I share my personality with you is to understand my research process. Actually, this presentation is part of my long-term project of comfort woman issue, intersecting with my experiences as activists and scholars. But I just try to focus on the several purposes of this presentation. First of all, I'd like to explore multiple encounters between activist survivors of Japanese military sexual slavery and solidarity activists, particularly focusing on stories of two foundational figures such as Yoon Jung-ho, a leading scholar and founder of the movement, and Kim Bok-dong, a survivor and human rights activist. And also, I'd like to share stories of some victim survivors and activists and the relationship between among them. The second, I'd like to show a history of multiple dialogues of people and memories to resituate subject, which led to overcoming personal trauma and reaching out to others, and to continuing the redress movement. Methodology and method. Obviously, this presentation is based on feminist qualitative research. I have principal guide as feminist. Of course, feminism is the most important guideline for me to do research. I think feminism is a political project to foster social change and to create more just world for women across differences. Second, I have been conducting ethnography in various fields, not just inside Korea, outside Korea, for over 20 years. And particularly for this presentation, I have been conducting oral history covering Korean activists, Japanese activists, and Korean victim survivors. I think oral history is very valuable for co-creation of meaning and knowledge. And also it is a kind of a rewarding and empowering experiences for me as a listener and participant, victims. And also textual analysis I have conducted because a historical document and testimony should be utilized for this presentation. So altogether, I'd like to juxtapose women's stories across time and place and documents and oral history. Those are pictures to show kind of, feeling of my ethnographic field research and also oral history place. So also I'd like to show some valuable, important figures to share with you. This one is Yoon Jong. Okay, I'd like to skip the theoretical conversations just to pinpointing the post-colonial feminist epistemology, feminist understanding of experiences, feminist cross-cultural communication, and translation issues to understand this kind of a project. Okay, I'd like to argue that throughout this presentation, people, particularly women, activists, and victim survivors, have been reinterpreting personal experiences as having been formed by imperialism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Second, they have been building up a community of caring. While caring for and healing with one another, women suggested the possibility of a new subjective formation. Third, women have been reconstructing identities as activists to challenge the historical and ongoing injustice, which led to reconstituting ourselves as a community of responsibility. And fourth, through mutually constructed identity, activist survivors and activists, and we broke away from social stigma deeply embedded in our body and soul, which has been constructed through Korean modern history and also East Asian modern history, and became agent who led to transformation of post-colonial society. Therefore, I think this work is to rewrite the history of women's struggle located in the geopolitical peculiarity of the East Asia Cold War system. Okay, the first phase is about colonized girls facing war and gender-based violence. Because of time limit, I feel very sorry. I cannot introduce all the very beautiful and touching women's narrative. Instead, you can just, read in your mind. A girl who had been born a daughter of a peasant in Yangsan, South Gyeongsang province, in 1926, thus become a Japanese military comfort woman. She enforced to leave her home and arrived in Guangdong, China, after passing through Busan, South Korea, Shimonoseki, Japan, and Taiwan. She was put on a military truck and sent to a place that resembled a hospital. After being examined for venereal disease, she was trapped in a comfort station. She ran away in fear and tried to kill herself, but was soon caught and subsequently suffered horrendous abuse and unfinished sexual violence. Her name is Kim Bok-dong. Another girl who was born to rich liberation movement activist family in Mountain Gunggang, Gangwon province in 1925, and attended a school in Seoul, faithfully avoided the misfortune. The young girl, who had been attending Ihwa Women's College, dropped out of school because she was not married, could be taken as 정신대 at the time, they were told, and was scared after signing a document that seemed like a pledge to follow a national mobilization law. Her parent, who had made her drop out of school, hurried their daughter's marriage. It was a time when men, Korean men, were dragged into forced labor, forced to marry, feeling that they should at least leave their seed, children. And the parents of daughters were marrying them off to any man, whether they were old, whether they were widowed, whether they were sick, whether they were poor. The marriage eventually did not take place because of the girl's will. And as the war loomed on the horizon, her father led the family back to Mountain Gumgang. Her name is Yoon Jung-ho. Although their socioeconomic differences, class differences, would lead them down different life paths, both these girls were structural victims of Japanese colonialism, militarism, and androcentric patriarchy. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and the colonial rule officially ended. However, the women did not experience peace and justice. Most Japanese military comfort women victims were abandoned at the battlefield or even massacred. Those who were able to survive, board, train by themselves, and sometimes they worked back, while others were detained in Allied forces, prisoner of war camp, later taking ships back. Many survivors internalized the idea, and they were shameful, and either did not return to their hometown or remained quiet about their past. With unimaginable and painful history experiences buried in their heart, they led lives of self-consolation, as they were neglected by close families, society, and their own country, Korea. Kim Bok-dong, who had returned home, but barely recovered, eventually confessed her experiences to her mother, because her mother kept pushing Kim Bok-dong to get married. Shocked by Kim's story, her mother eventually passed out later. Kim Bok-dong took on guilt for what had happened to her. In time, she followed her mother's wishes and married an old man, but she returned to her mother's house after a short while. Afterward, she traveled to Busan, went to Busan, and made a living by running a small store there. Yoon Jung-ho, who returned to Seoul after liberation, asked around for news of her peers who signed with their thumbprint during colonial time. She heard unbelievably terrible news from those who returned, which made her feel anger, furious toward the humans who had committed such wrongdoings and violated human dignity. After Korean War broke out, Yoon Jung-ho and her family fled to Busan and then Jeonju. In 1953, while Yoon was still staying in Jeonju and the Korean War was nearing its end, Yoon took a cargo ship from Busan, went to the United States to study abroad. Her decision was inspired by a wish to leave the disastrous country and by her frustration with the lack of academic opportunities available for women at the time. Having received a scholarship to cover her tuition cost, Yoon Jung-ho studied very, very hard. Upon returning to Korea, she became a professor of English at Ewha Women's University. Due to the guilt she felt toward the woman in her generation, toward the women in the Japanese military comfort station, were always in Yoon's mind. Yoon Jung-ho, who had been collecting materials on her own and looking for a surviving comfort woman, learned about survivor Baebonggi through a Japanese newspaper article. Eventually, she visited Baebonggi in 1980, which was very, very amazing, I think. Baebonggi was living in Okinawa, Japan at the time. Meeting Baebonggi was very risky because Baebonggi was supported by North Korea affiliated civic group led by 조선족 Korean Japanese Kim Hyun-ok and Kim Su-seok. And because at the time, South Korea was under very extreme military dictatorship. But Yoon Jong-ok was not afraid. She may have recognized that the basic principle of redress movement should be with victims. Through this meeting, I think. Yoon Jong-ok wrote an article titled People Who Were Taken Away, published in Hanguk-ilbo, Korean newspaper, in 1981, in which she reported a bad story, Baebonggi's story, to the public. However, the story did not gain much attention under the Chun Doo-hwan military dictatorship. As Yoon pointed out, personal rage and doubt have been paramount in sustaining her dedication to the military comfort woman issue. However, without encounters with the victim survivor and the people who hope to take responsibility for a historic issue, the emotions may have remained merely a temporary agenda. Through multiple encounters and solidarity with the victims, Yoon's critical consciousness and activism expanded and later came onto the global stage. Yoon's lonely journey expanded to drive collective action and revealed the truth about Japanese comfort women. Thanks to the help of the Professor Lee Hyo-jae and kind of long-time friend, and the organizational support of the Korean Church Women United. Lee Hyo-jae, a professor of sociology at Ewha University at the time, was a founder of Korean Women's Studies and the Sociology on National Division, 분단사회학 in Korea. She had also been involved in various movements for social justice, with a deep insight on geopolitical issues surrounding Korean Peninsula. Lee Hyo-jae positioned the essence of the Japanese military comfort woman issue, not only history of colonization, but as an issue that has been marginalized in a sexist society, where gender, class, race, Cold War tensions, and the division of the Korean Peninsula intersected. The most decisive moment for organizing activism was the Yoon's encounter with the Korean Church Women United, KCW. In December 1987, Lee Hyo-jae introduced Yoon Jong-ok to KCW. With its dedicated support, Yoon Jong-ok got a visa to Japan and started investigating the Japanese comfort woman issue. Alongside Kim Shin-sil and Kim Hae-won, this one is Kim Shin-sil, and the other one woman is Kim Hae-won. Yoon Jong-ok visited the Kyushu region, including Fukuoka, Tokashiki Island in Okinawa, Tokyo, and other places for tracing the footprint of comfort woman. At that time, the comfort woman was, interchangeably used with the 정신대, the term 정신대. It was a very difficult trip, but the trip altered both individual lives and history. The result of investigation and accumulation of Yoon's research were officially presented to the activists in Korea and abroad at the International Symposium titled Women and Sex Tourism Culture. in Jeju Island from April 21 to 23 in 1988, 5 months before the Olympic Games. Japanese Korean participants in particular were immensely stunned by Yoon Jong-uk's presentation. As Yoon Young-ae recalled, everyone was crying as if the Holy Spirit has prevailed upon Mark's ethic, the Maga's darakbang. Participants' experience of being deeply involved in other women's lives and newly formed womanhood across space and time had become the driving force for further investigation and research on the Japanese military comfort woman and the formation of the movement. Later, the Japanese participant stood at the forefront of the movement on the issue. For example, Takashi Kikue, this person, of Gyophunghae, Japan Christian Women's Organization, was inspired by Yoon's presentation and continued to actively advocate for and stand in solidarity with relevant issues of comfort women. On November 16, 1990, women who had been discussing the need to organize systematic responses to the Japanese government denial gathered 27 women's organizations, including KCW, to establish the Korean Church for the women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan. And Kim Ok-sun's press conference on August 14, 1991, shook not only Korea, but the entire world. Kim Ok-sun believed that she had survived for the space of testimony that may open up one day. She said, I had buried what had happened in my heart because it was so utterly painful. But I cannot bear people forgetting the past. I cannot bear people clinging onto Japan. Her testimony led to Korean Council to establish the Comfort Woman Hotline on September 18, 1991. Kim Ok-sun's courage in coming forward as a Comfort Woman survivor, despite people's contempt, inspired many other victims. On December 2nd of the same year, Moon Ok-ju of Daegu came forward and Kim Bok-sun followed. In January the following year, Kim Bok-dong finally came forward, saying, one day I saw on television about registering for Japanese military comfort women. I discussed the matter with my younger sister, who told me not to register because my nephew will be ashamed. But I registered because I couldn't deny my 7 years. The 7 years I was harassed like an animal in the rainforest. In witnessing the public visibility of other survivors who had similar experiences and facing the pain of I went through the same, survivors found that their desire to reveal their resentment burst out. They hoped that people would listen to their stories, treat them with human decency. Hwang Geum-ju, Kang Deok-kyung, Kim Soo-no followed. And Jan Luf O'Heren, a Dutch Australian survivor, also were determined to come out. I think already the time is over, so I would like to skip the several contents. Instead, I'd like to show, some pictures for you sense or feel the women's experiences. Let me conclude. Thanks to the effort of victim survivors and activists over the world, we, embodied others as women, have all been deeply engaged in the movement for the resolution of the Japanese military sexual slavery. As Yoon Jong-uk's confession, we have been able to open our eyes and listen to women's sufferings. We have been able to see history from women's perspectives and thus reconstruct it. We have realized that the issue was not only an unfortunate incident that happened to some woman in some part of Asia a long time ago. Instead, this issue is deeply connected to violence against women that continues today. We have realized that we should bear political responsibility to change the world. That's why we are talking to each other nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Whenever I get to hear the stories of comfort women, it saddens me very profoundly. And today was not an exception. And it was absolutely fabulous to get to hear more about the connections and camaraderie shared by the women of different class background, different nationalities. Sometimes by listening to the narratives, we often feel helpless, but their camaraderie and their creation of community of caring, which was transformed into community of responsibility, was empowering. And I was very elated and happy to hear about your analysis and the framework to interpret the crisscrossings between and among the women of differences by looking at the shared experiences between them, shared experiences as colonized women, shared experiences of women who have been subjugated to patriarchal socio-political order. So thank you very much again, Professor Lee, for your presentation. I have learned a lot, and let us move on to the second presentation by Professor Joshua Pilzer. Did I pronounce your name right? Is it Pilzer or Pilzer? We cannot hear you. Could you turn on your microphone? Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. No, if you got it on the first try. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. He is going to talk about his research entitled Song, Speech, and the Work of Listening to Comfort Women Survivors. Without further ado, Professor Pilzer.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Ko and to the Academy for Korean Studies. Thank you also to Dr. Lee for an amazing presentation. It's wonderful to see that the Chongdae is in such formidable hands, another set of extremely formidable hands. I learned a lot from that presentation. I also want to thank all of you and all of the panelists. I noticed that I'm the only guy, on this panel. It didn't escape my notice, and that is to me a great honor. And I appreciate being invited very, very much. I also changed my opening slide after Dr. Lee spoke to us about Kim Bok-dong, because I have this wonderful picture of Kim Bok-dong, and basically, right, I wanted to show you this picture, and here behind her is Pak Duri standing, and here sitting playing the tango to her left is Pae Chun-hee and many other people who you have known, I think, for a long time and much longer than me. This work, I have to say that, so speaking of positionality, I started off as a master's student with an interest in Korean vocal music, and I started studying traditional sadosori, which is a kind of traditional vocalization song genre from the north, which was primarily the custodians of which were kinyo, professional female entertainers. But I didn't know anyway. So I gradually got more and more invested in the study of Korean women's music. And song in particular, and that led me to this project. Let's see. And really, what led me directly to this project was this book, which is a English language translation of the first volume of the Hanguk Jeongsundae Yongguso's series of testimonies of the Korean comfort women. And as I was reading through it, I noticed that the women kept singing. And you know what it's like when you read a book and suddenly you're reading and suddenly it goes like that, and then you know that people are singing. Right? So I thought that was fascinating and important somehow, and so I spent the next 10 years or so trying to answer that question by spending time at the in Seoul and all over the Korean Peninsula, with probably, I guess, 40 or so survivors, but mostly at Nanume-jip in the South Korean countryside near Gyeonggi-do, Gwangju. And here I am, much younger. You can see, my hair was not white then, and I was a lot more, and let's see. So you see Hwang Geum-ju here also, and you see Kim Sun-dok laying down over here. And everybody looks, well, these two are lost, and I look a lot different, and Yoon-su looks about the same, as she does today. So I don't know. What am I trying to say? I'm telling you how I got involved in this project. So I spent time over the course of around 2002 to 2012. Every year I visited Nanume-jip and Suyoship and all these different and other Busan and Daegu and other places around the peninsula, talking to survivors and trying to answer the question why there were so many songs in that book. In the course of doing so, I created an anthology of around maybe 400 or so. No, sorry, that's around 200 songs and stories about them. And then from then I've been working for the last 10 years. I've been working with Korean survivors of experiences of forced labor and war and the bomb in Hiroshima. So I've been, and of course, because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to go back to visit Korea for probably 4 years now. And 정말 답답하네. And I look at all these pictures of all these women who are so dear to all of us, and many of them are gone now, And so it's a very mixed emotions to present on this material. So as I said, when I went to Korea wondering about the songs that were in that book, and also having seen a lot of canonical pictures that we all know from the comfort women history and the memorialization of the comfort women, and pictures of historical pictures like this and pictures of protest. At this point, things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. At this point, almost all of the pictures were in black and white, right? Whether they were in the present or in the past. And you very rarely saw pictures like this, taken by photographer Choi Yo-won a year or two before I got to the House of Sharing. So this was the kind of scene that I encountered And there was in the midst of this very powerful protest movement, these very powerful, impressive victim survivors who I could find very little out about, I think, after 1945. And I think people like Dr. Lee and Yumihang Tepeonim and many other people who are very close in the movement knew a lot about them in the post-war, but very little of that had come through in the documentation. And so I got interested I was really delighted to be a part of a project called Centering the Survivors, because that's what I've been trying to do for the last 20 years or so. And the idea of the way that the comfort women issue is described as an issue or a problem, as opposed to as a collection of people who suffered, under sexual violence during war and Japanese intersection of Japanese, racist violence in the Korean Peninsula and throughout East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These people, if it all begins with people suffering and with their survival, and so to call it the comfort women issue has never sat well with me, and to think instead about the comfort women victim survivors, or harmony, or however you want to go about it. So my fieldwork involved obviously a lot of going around and singing, and I thought that everyone would sing songs, old songs, but basically the songs that I collected, I would say around 50 of them were from the 1930s and 1940s, but everything else was more contemporary. And so for the last, for all this time, I wrote a book about it. It's called Hearts of Pine, which you can, some of you probably have read, and it concerns all the ways that survivors who I encountered use song as a resource for survival, as a mode of expression which is alternate to speech during that long period of so-called silence about their experiences, as a means of developing a voice, which later in the 1990s becomes the voice that they use to testify with. Also using song and story as a way of narrating the past and oneself, and of, in some sense, taking charge of one's story. Also as a means of remembering and forgetting, a practice of social connectivity, connecting with one another, obviously, and a daily work of survival. So that is what I've been up to, and I thought I would, and this really means narrating a broad swath of life, and this connects to the second half of the title of the panel today, What Remains. A tremendous amount, I believe, remains. I think the situation of violence against women remains. In fact, we're probably in South Korea in store for a fresh wave of violence against women, unfortunately. Violence against women in wartime, colonial violence against women, and so on, is very much a part of our lives, as is the ongoing issue of military sex work and military violence against sex workers, which intersects with colonialism, obviously, as well. So some songs. So I've been talking long enough, I think, and what I would like for us to do is to listen to some of these materials. So this is Pae Chun-hee, who passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, and who many of us knew. She was from Seongju, outside of Daegu, and was taken as a comfort woman in just across the border, the North Korean border, into Manchuria, and had a rather epic life after that, and spoke 4 languages and ended up trying to return to Korea, but during the Korean War and not being able to, and living in Japan for 20 years and working as a cabaret singer. So she continued to work in a kind of nightlife culture. That was after she spent a year in Harbin learning Russian and working in a kind of surjit kind of drinking house there. So yes, Petruni. So I got interested for this presentation in thinking about how we could get to know, right, these women after the war. And one of the things that occurs to me is that, and in some sense, looking for the agency of the comfort women victim survivors after the war as one way of getting to know them and one way of understanding their legacy. And so I was thinking about the comfort women survivors as workers. And so the first song that I have for you is a kind of transcript of that. This is Petruni singing a song, a Japanese version of Arirang, Korea's most famous folk song, new folk song, that she sang both during her time as a comfort woman and after. So I'll play that for you now. And please let me know, if someone give me a thumbs up, then I know that you could hear it.
아리랑?
일본 말로.
나도 일본 말 하잖아. 아리랑 아리랑 아라리요 아리랑 고개를 넘어간다.
아이 김순덕 할머니.
네.
안녕하세요.
와로소 그 신가라 모에르
할머니.
아나타와 아람푸데 치사치바카리 그거 하나 둘 다섯 겪고 일본 말로 알아 내가 다. 난 다 해.
다섯 언어.
응?
다섯 언어. 알았다고.
아리랑 아리랑 아라리요 아리랑 고개로 넘어간다. 그게 하지.遠く離れて会いたい時は月달月が鏡있잖아鏡거울 있잖아月が鏡になればよい月が鏡巡り볼 수 있으면 좋겠다.
달이 거울이라고.
달이.
So this song is a version of Arirang that circulated in Japan during the colonial period on record, and this is the kind of thing that comfort women were routinely asked to perform for Japanese soldiers, and the fantasy here is the fantasy of a Korean woman, exoticized colonial subaltern Korean woman singing to a Japanese man when we're far apart and wish to meet if only the moon would become a mirror. So it's this very ambivalent performance in the comfort station of domination, but at the same time it provides this forum for women to be heard and to elicit sympathy from people and so on. In any case, a very this also helps to, because this is a song that she then sang in the cabaret later on, and she was asked to wear hanbok in the cabaret and to present as a exoticized Korean woman again. And so there's a connection in this song between the sexual labor of the comfort station and the sexual labor in the post-war. Okay, so moving on. So speaking of sexual labor in the post-war, many different women were funneled into all different kinds of sex industries all over East Asia. Wherever they happened to be. Many of the comfort stations were converted into comfort stations for newly occupying American military and so on. And some people were funneled into the Camptown sex industries surrounding the American military bases in Seoul, north of Seoul. And this is our old and dear friend Kim Sun-ak. My Korean name is Cho Su Ah. So we both had the Su and Ah, right? And we had a kind of connection because of that. This is her favorite song, which is Pinerin Homoryong, which is a song from 1948. But I'll let you listen to her sing the first verse.
내 부리는 것도 이제 우리 엄마랑 이별할 때 그때 부리는 그때 내가 이제 철나고 이제 알지 그때는 무슨 노래인가도 몰랐는데 내가 생각해 보니까 어머님의 손을 놓고 돌았을 때에 부엉새도 울었다오 나도 울었어 1절 그러면서 술 한잔 먹고 젊을 때는 만날 그래가 울고
또 울었게 됐다고.
그래야지 울지 술 안 울면은 노래하고
So she only sings the first verse of this song here, but the Pinerin Homoryong, there's a lot of ideas about where it comes from, but one of the origin stories of the song is that it has to do with women being taken away in the early during the colonial period, girls taken away from their mothers, and so you have this 어머니의 손을 놓고 and this song of parting, you know, and the last verse makes specific reference to the kinds of places that Kim Sun-ok and many other people worked in the post-war. In the flickering light of this tavern, I write these complaints on my palm, and tonight I will sing. So it's a song about working in a place where you're expected to sing. So and in the course of my encounters with comfort women victim survivors, the story very often of a
내 부리는 것도 이제
a woman working on the margins of society. There are many songs like this in the Pongchak, Turotu, Tejungayo, popular song, Ovra. And let's see, is someone telling me I'm running out of time? Oh, good, thank you. Not yet. Okay. There are many songs like this, and those songs are appropriated by comfort women survivors to express their not only at the simultaneously, I think, their experience of the wartime, but also their experience in the post-war of living on the margins of society. At the same time, these are popular songs, right? So it's a moment where your experience of marginality is shared very broadly, by the medium of an immensely popular song. And so here in this picture, we see Moon Pil-gi, who many of you know, who was from Chinju, also in Gyeongsang-namdo, and was in a very similar part of Manchuria as Pae Chun-hee, and who, when she came back, she actually walked back from Manchuria to Seoul in the late winter, which is an amazing feat. An immensely powerful person, and ended up, she was deeply traumatized, post-traumatic stress disorder, and was also in one of these situations where people were trying to marry her, and so she left home and lived in various places around South Korea through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and again working in drinking houses, and she sang this song.
낯설은 타양다 그날 밤 그 조각이 웬일이 나를 못 이게 하네 기다두네 싫은 사람 뜨내기 사랑 울어라 기다야 나의 기다야. 그래 그전에는 거의 잘 넘어갔는데 지금 자꾸 알아서 안 돼.
And this the second verse, if you compare her version with the original song, this is very very different, and she's made this 그림자 내 고향, that's this my home in the shadows. That is a line that she actually made up, and it's not in the original song. And it's this song of unrequited love, and also a song of a musician wandering on the outskirts, the margins of society. Moonpigi was an amazing person. She basically changed every song that she sang, even though these songs are popular songs. And if you go to Norebang, if you go to like karaoke, you can find them, in their original texts for the most part. But she was very free, in almost a folkloric kind of way. If you find this with folk songs as well, people are very free, especially women, in recomposing the texts of songs. And she was a master of that. She also, she had a whole story of her Shipalban. Shipalban is your kind of centerpiece song. And her Shipalban would change like every 10 years or so. And so there's a whole genealogy of Moonpigi's Shipalban as she changes the song to something more contemporary to remain in contact with contemporary society, which was very important to her. And that work too was a kind of work of maintaining some feeling of social connectedness, despite this marginalized and repressed life that she led. Let's see. Okay, I probably have a 2-minute warning now. Okay, so unfortunately I have to skip a few of these. It goes without saying that Yoljawe Iseng is very popular among almost anyone who is a devotee of this particular genre among Korean victim survivors, but I'm going to skip that one. And I'm going to go because I'm running out of time, and I'm going to give the last word, as it were. I've been talking mostly about the work of being a comfort woman, the work of sex and entertainment industries, post-war, military and otherwise. But women also did many, many different kinds of work. And in some sense, you could consider comfort women victim survivors to have been members and participants in the labor movement that carried through that came to a peak in the 70s and the 1980s. And so I wanted to play this song, which is a song of entertainment, but one of those songs that people often sing when farming. And this is Yoon Su getting ready to cross the street in Daegu in a rare color picture from a while ago, singing the song Kwejinga Chinchinane, which is a folk song from the southeast. And nobody knows what it means, but Kwejinga Chinchin, some of these things are most certainly the onomatopoeia for farmers' band instruments, pengari at the beginning, and then ching, the gong in the middle. So it has to do with farmers' culture and the kind of song that you sing while you work in the fields or processing things from the fields, etc. So I'll play that, and that will be the end of my presentation. So thank you all very much for your attention. And here is Yoon Su and others on the beach. And Kim Sunak actually is also part of this group, so you can hear her voice if you listen carefully.
지나 싱싱나네 너자 너자 젊은 너자 지나 싱싱나네 늙고 병들면 못 노자니 지나 싱싱나네 절시고 좋다 절시고 좋다 지나 싱싱나네 아이고 소리는 적고 사람은 많네 지나 싱싱나네 절시고 좋다 절시고 좋네 지나 싱싱나네 헐개를 벌리라 헐개를 벌리라 우리 초면에 쳐지 어제 자꾸 그 노래를 지나 칭칭나네 노자 노자 젊어서 노자 지나 칭칭나네 늙고 병들만 못 너나 아니 지나 칭칭나네 아이고 저보다 소리는 적다 지나 칭칭나네 늙어서 못하겠다 간다 지나 칭칭나네 절시 좋다 절시고 좋다 제일 좋다가 나네 너 좀 해라 뭐 내 돼서 뭐
Thank you all very much.
네, 조수아 선생님, 예, 너무 감사합니다. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fabulous. The comfort within just so much come alive with their songs in the recorded files, and I'm just struck by their livelihood, their self-expression, their effort to express their feelings in those songs. They are very powerful, and I, just two thoughts came to my mind. One was that I thought it was very interesting for you to see them as workers in sex and entertainment industry and other industries such as farming. So that is, I think, one of the ways to see them differently, to shed different light on their holistic life experiences, because we have been so obsessed with their life, their experiences of victimization and sexual exploitation. So your perspective, I find very refreshing. And another thing that came to my mind was that until I went to the US and Japan, I never realized that Koreans were singing and dancing folks. Koreans are really into singing and dancing. And when I was living in Hiroshima, whenever there was time for hanami, cherry blossom festival, always at the edge of the river bank, under the last cherry blossom tree, they were blasting their stereos and listening to enka, and singing and dancing and drinking and having a good time. It was such a drastic contrast between Chinese Koreans and Japanese. And I thought that was fantastic, And another thing that came to my mind was that I was wondering whether we can draw a parallel between African American experiences in terms of their contribution to music industry. I mean, there are versions of music such as jazz, soul, and blues. They totally transformed white-centric American music industry. And I don't know, it's really hard to tell, because the former comfort women in sex and entertainment industry who were singing at the cabaret would have made such impact. But it's still, when we contextualize their jobs, their work within the large umbrella rubric of Korean cultural peculiarities, or I don't know, special qualities. I'm wondering whether we can draw a parallel between comfort women entertainers and African American entertainers in white dominant American society. So that we are going to have a Q&A session later on. So it's just my 2 cents. I didn't read your paper, I didn't read your abstract, but these thoughts just came to my head. And the third presentation will be made by Professor Melrose Huang, and she is going to talk about good as political disobedience, healing, and resilience. Okay. Could you?
Yes, thank you, Professor Kim. I want to also thank you to the Academy for Korean Studies and University of Baltimore, Dr. Ko, and all the presenters, my fellow panelists, for educating me so much. And this panel is so amazing. I mean, I've been learning so much, such an immense amount, and I'm enjoying the session so much. So thank you so much for bringing me into the circle. So a little bit of I've been trying to modify what I'm going to present based on the information that's already been given. So I'm a historian, and so I work in archives, not as much in ethnography, but here I am trying to venture into dabbling with ethnography without really being legitimately able to do that. So I think there are other people, Professor Pilzer and Dr. Nayoung Lee, who can probably help make sense of a lot of the things that I've seen on this, but it's really my way of dabbling into some of the sites that I had visited, mainly alongside Professor Kim Sung-nae from Sewang University, who's a professor emeritus now, and trying to make sense of that from the years when I was a master's and a PhD candidate. I'll give you first an introduction and then go into what we'll be talking about in this presentation. And then if there's some time remaining, I'll show you some slides of the things that I had witnessed in the field. Rituals of mass injustice offer new vantage points for elucidating the specters that repeatedly enter and re-enter the Cold War landscape. I consider mass atrocity-based shamanic rituals as a form of specter that foregrounds historiography. I use Jacques Derrida's notion of specter as a haunting that has an ephemeral affective presence in the tumult of 1940s Korea. Specter's revenant, invoking what was, and arrivant, announcing what will come, signals several temporalities. The future is made to interact with the past and present by imposing the past upon the present and by imbuing the future with possibility. So for Derrida, ontology liberates events from historical overdetermination and offers a welcome disruption from chronology. So this was quite useful for me as I was thinking between the Comfort Women rituals and the Jeju Sasam Sakon rituals. The post-massacre ritual is a time channel and a spectral through line. What I mean by this is that those ghosts present the past, and they press hard on questions of today and tomorrow. They give historical starting points, but they may not have a clear resolve. Post-colonial Korean studies should submit to this haunting and to the inherent possibility that it invokes. The haunting is itself a success and a failure. It is concrete as well as symbolic. It is real as well as ghostly. It lives, but it's also among the dead. So what I call ritual vigilantism. This focuses on what shamanic rituals that are on the other side of colonial difference, what happens in that other side. So this reminds me of what Frantz Fanon calls as the solidarity of the colonized, a kind of illuminating and sacred communication. Although shamanic communities claim they do not work on political agendas, it appears to me that participants reenact epistemic injustice, internecine violence, and complicate Cold War epistemologies within the kutang or the ritual space. These ritual communities can affirm bodies of knowledge that are denied, challenge state-mandated violence, point to administrative failures, and enable grassroots measures to protect precarious populations. So in today's presentation, I want to briefly cover three things. So first, I'll be talking about the characteristics of the 1940s, talking around the things that have already been covered, hopefully, to kind of demonstrate the continuation of colonial systems of power from the Japanese to the American transition. Then I'm going to skip to the late 80s when, as Professor Lee Na-young had already talked about, when grassroots organizations began using these cases in their political movements, and that movement started to be generated, but looking specifically at the shamanistic and other indigenous motifs and how they were involved in those political mobilizations. And then lastly, I want to look at some images of Mugut, a shamanic ritual that commemorate those comfort women and Jeju massacre, to illustrate the social and political function of ritual. So to begin, I think a lot of people here already know about the Japanese colonial history surrounding comfort women. So I'm just going to move on to try to connect that history to the tumult of the 1940s, particularly looking at the 1945 moment as that transitional period and what changed or didn't. So the fall of the Japanese Empire marked an era of continued hardship and devastation for Koreans, as we all understand. A few days before Japan announced its surrender, the United States had already created unilateral and hasty plans to separate the Korean peninsula along the 38th global latitudinal line. They immediately assumed and controlled the South, dashing Korea's hopes for sovereignty and liberation, so Haebang never happened. Right? American officials consulted no Koreans in coming to this decision, nor did they ask for the opinions of the British or the Chinese, both of whom were to take part in this planned trusteeship of Korea. To get a better handle on this new foreign population, the U.S. Defense Department amassed a team to draft orientation packets for their military. So what I found really interesting about this was that people like Felix Keesing asserted that anthropology was needed for efficient administration over the Pacific area, quote, especially the adjustment of the so-called native or indigenous populations to modern civilization, unquote. Army General John Hodge echoed the same point. Quote, primitives for their own self-respect and protection must adjust their lives progressively to modern world conditions, unquote. Other leading American anthropologists that we know of, like Ruth Fulton Benedict, Franz Boas, etc., these people were brought on board, all coming to the conclusion that people inhabiting U.S. occupied territories after 1945 were spiritually backwards. One such training manual noted, quote, of the Korean religions, shamanism or spirit worship is the most ancient. Its introduction among the Korean people have been lost in the gloom of prehistoric times, unquote. So what I'm seeing here is that the plight of people ravished by colonial decimation, total war, statelessness, PTSD, these were being mischaracterized as primitivism. By 1945, Koreans comprised a third of Japan's entire industrial labor force, with many forced to work in the harshest industries, the most dangerous wartime environments, and many comfort women were cases of testaments to this, as we had seen in previous presenters. Claims for Korean repatriation were compounded by the social instability of deterritorialization. The so-called liberation was overshadowed by violence, assaults, lootings, and new rounds of displacement. The violence signified the arbitrary nature of the social relations that were consolidated through a patchwork of colonial laws and policies, but instantly vanished when the forces sustaining them disappeared. Some comfort women accounted that when the Japanese colonial government was replaced with an American one, they were simply ordered to change their outfits to serve the U.S. military. So in 1948, a South Korean National Assembly passed the National Traitors Act and outlawed the Workers' Party, setting the stage for anti-communist purges. A transnational network of evangelical anti-communism activity was made active between South Korea and the United States, creating a series of targeted civilian killings throughout the region. So the 1948 to 50 massacre in Jeju Island was among the first of those purges, with the better known Nogunmi and Shincheon massacres occurring 2 years later. These massacres that existed before, during, and after the Korean War were nothing short of what some scholars call a planned act of state terrorism. Let's move forward to then the 1980s. The democratic era of the late 80s, South Korea opened up new possibilities to explore national and subaltern pasts. From a Cold War status perspective, shamanism was used to link countries of vast differences together. From Asia to Oceania, Africa to the Americas, these are all brought under an umbrella of pre-modern culture, marking those as U.S. allied territories. So these are people who are really critiquing the Eliadian universalist model. These new post-war countries celebrated their indigeneity through shamanism, with the reinforcements of, in South Korea under Park Chung-hee, the 무형 문화재, the intangible cultural asset system, and so forth. And these were done as a means to validate this new, the heritage of the new state. So what is clear is that a kind of symbolic violence over everyday practices in the forms of mundane rationality that produced indigents under imperial forces were appropriated in places like this newly democratic South Korea, because shamanism operated as a synthesizing agent of knowledge. Its nationalistic expression was always already a posture of domination. Since 1945, the space that shamanism occupied in a real and metaphorical sense had researchers focusing on Gutang as a location for social suppression and hegemony. The national celebration of shamanism that emerged in the 80s did not reconcile this modern history of suppression. Throughout the 20th century, Korean intellectuals used the print media to hunt down, incarcerate, beat, ostracize, humiliate, dehumanize popular ritual specialists. They intended to destroy shamanism without reservation. But in the cultural revival of the 80s, any traces of anti-shamanism were blamed on Japanese colonizers, glossing over the continuity of colonialism and imperial exploitation. I go back to Frantz Fanon to think about the setbacks of colonial domination and what it does. He says it actually strengthens the collective will of the oppressed against the oppressor. So through shamanic ritual, subaltern communities also of the 80s commiserated on their common struggle to gain their right to constitute a people. Fanon calls this a, quote, carnal and spiritual union between colonized peoples, the historic commitment of the oppressed to help one another and to impose a definitive setback upon the forces of exploitation, end quote. In 1980 South Korea, a new custom of ritualized protest helped to collectively express political resistance against oppressive state initiatives, with particular focus on anti-Americanism. So the rise of Madangguk, or the People's Theater, incorporated elements of folk theater and shamanic ritual. Chung Moo Choi and other people talk about this a lot, as constantly a way of constantly remembering the people's history or a social memory. Madangguk became a method of performing a narrative of marginalized people to voice their collective concern, which helped to establish shamanism as a pinnacle characteristic of a new democracy. Political resistors in the South Korean state both found usages then for shamanism. The very cultural motifs created by, for, or against the state were appropriated then in assertions of indigenous folk identity. So let me see if I could turn here to showing you some pictures, kind of break it up. So let's see here. This is, sorry about these photos. I was, this is me being a novice ethnographer here when I was doing some of these, taking these photos. So this was the photos taken at the Seoul Donggu Women's Development Center back in November 2003. They detail the account showing the 13th annual coup that was happening in this area. And you can see here, and these are not in really good order. You're going to kind of go from like top left to top right, and then bottom left to bottom right, kind of in that order. But in the Haewon Jinwon-gu, they're known for having 12 stages, and I obviously didn't capture those stages, but captured ones I thought were really quite interesting. So you've got the Honshin over here, and the main shrine, and then the Kun Manshin. They're lining up to kind of ask the guardian spirits to bless the space and to allow the ritual to commence by doing this balancing of the boars on top of the stand in order to that balance to demonstrate then that they have been given the official okay. And then on the bottom left, you got the kind of the nerim happening where the the tutelary spirits are being are now descending on the body of the Manchin, and they're doing the kind of series of those types of initiation dances. And then, quite interestingly, what's happening on the bottom right is once the and this David Kim, who was attending this with me, speaks about this quite extensively in the journal Position, so you can read about it more up there. But this is the illustration where we've got the girl, 13-year-old girl, has descended on this Manchin when she is actually possessed, and she is hysterical. It's very difficult to console her, but at this, as the different attendants are trying to help her and making sure that she's not going to die from this overwhelm, and there's everybody's bawling their eyes out, and there are these different harmony that are sitting in the front of the space. They're interacting with her and trying to console her, and they both find out, like she says that she was in Manchuria. This woman, who I didn't get the name of, she said that she was in Burma, and she said that she knew her plight, what she was going through, trying to console her with this kind of commiserating on their shared suffering. But then at one point, the spirit turns to her. The girl says, "Why are you talking down to me? I'm older than you." And everybody kind of bursts out laughing because they're breaking of decorum. Here's a picture of the Honshin. So this, when that spirit girl, when she first descended on the Manchin, she's looking at the Honshin and she's saying, "Where's my name? Why is my name not here?" And at that point, a bunch of Manshin have to come together and say, "We're very sorry that we didn't acknowledge you here. We didn't know about you. Please tell us your story." Another interesting aspect here that I found was, you see on the sides of this auditorium the shrine tables for each of the provinces of the unified peninsula, kind of reinforcing this point that I make about how in the ritual space they constantly return to the pre-modern nation, and that's their point of reference. This is something that I would probably want to explore with you if people are interested about some of the internal struggles that are happening around the Comfort Women movement. I had spoken with Mr. Tsukasa Yajima of the House of Sharing, and he was telling me about the whistleblowing that had happened there a few months, no, was it a little while ago, and where there's been some embezzlement, mistreatment of emotional abuse, he says, towards the survivor, Harmonider, and fabrication of official and private documents. And so how these internal struggles then, what kinds of hurdles they're presenting in the movement. That's something that I was wondering if anybody else knows about, people who are on the ground, and if they're willing to share that information. Going to the Jeju Sasang Hakon, we have this is let's see if I got the names right here. So this is Yoon Su Bang, and he is presiding over in the same year at the Nobun Sungi location of Pukchonni in northern Jeju Island. This is the first ritual at this site, and he's on the lower right-hand side right here. And here there were about we know that there were about 300 villagers who were killed, making this the moment where there were the highest number of civilians murdered in a single incident during the Jeju Sasam. And the massacre was carried out in these fields and farms near the Pukchon Elementary School. And what I'll be continuing to talk about in my paper is about this ritual dramatization. So we've got this is Ieju Chinonmud Shimbang. She's throwing herself down in a dream-induced dance, displaying the violence to, and the description says, to appease the victims of the atrocity. Basically, she's calling the souls of those aggrieved ghosts through this reenactment, a very detailed narrative of the killing itself. Here's another version of that happened a couple of years later. This is in the Gwangdeokjeong 4-3 Culture and Arts Festival, where a similar kind of reenactment is happening, but in a much more theatrical way. And this image here on the left-hand side is the honshin that was used in the original original ritual, and then how that information then gets translated into the actual permanent memorial itself. So in the honshin, you see on the right side those memorial placards then of the deceased. Their names then were elaborated. Here we have, this is the Nobun Seunggi Sasam Kinyongkwan, the memorial hall. We have in that their names in Hangul, Hanja, the gender, their age, and the date of their killing, and also the locations where the corpses were found. These unmarked graves. So this is actually the Ompangbat, what they call Ompangbat, which is like a farming field that saw the location where they saw the most killing. And in this area, it's really quite interesting because the dead bodies are scattered around the field in the location and the shape in which they were found. And this is right next to the Pukchon Elementary School, where it's really been explained that this was called the village of no men because literally they had eradicated all the men from the village. And something that we see also in and around Jeju Island is all of the different memorials that are in semi-development form, semi-official form, and at varying distances from the official narrative that you see in the Peace Park. And so on the right-hand side, you've got these private memorials like this Hannam Village Victims Memorial, where they're talking about their own version of the massacre in that area. And right around the corner from there is the Korean War Patriots Memorial. And that was a really interesting juxtaposition. So those are some of the people that I need to give thanks to. In particular, this man here, Woo Young Kim, and his sister Kyung Kim, who were the children of Shinbang that really helped host our research trip. So, going back to the presentation, what I found was so the South Korean National Intelligence Service, their arrest and torture of its citizens was brought to the fore in this post-democratic era. International spotlights were placed on South Korea's pro-democracy demonstrations, and the state ordered the reinstatement of civil rule before the majority population could freely explore contemporary mass atrocities. And so as a result of opening, these stories of the history of comfort women system and the Jeju Sasan massacre reached the public eye in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I think that Dr. Lee Na-young did an amazing presentation on that. And I was really grateful to hear the details on Yoo Jung-ok's path-breaking work from her presentation. The shaman community was at the forefront of the communities of the aggrieved, often donating their services for ritual recognition of those restless spirits and their descendants. And so it's really interesting, I think, to see them in like the first in as these stories are coming to the fore. The story of the massacre centers on the Manshin, or master shaman, who is possessed by spirit of someone who was wrongfully killed. On the Comfort Woman, the Haewon Jinwon that we attended, Dr. David Kim reflects on this. He says the spirits themselves are always somehow spectacularly and temporally out of joint. There's a kind of paradoxical incorporation involved. They are at one body and ghost, matter and specter, past and present. These all converge at times between becoming muddled. In her dream or in her realm, the spirit is lost, but in entering the present, she's equally disoriented. With a foot in each world, she is both in and out of time, filling the moment with her ghostly yet material presence, unquote. Also in the early 2000s, the Haewon Saengsangut was conducted to commemorate the souls of the wrongfully deceased in Jeju 4/3 incident. In these ritual spaces, spirits of the traumatically killed descend into live bodies of Manchin, acting out the horror of their past, casting their experiences into a shared historical consciousness by conversing with other beings in their ritual space. So let me just read my conclusions as we're running out of time. Manchin stored tremendous amount of data on both natural and supernatural agents to navigate counter-narratives that encourage descendants to mourn for their ancestors who may not have been tagged as enemies of the state, dangerous or insignificant. These vigilante rituals are scripted, produced, and recorded by women and others of the political margin, enabling a dialogue about history that would otherwise be determined by those who wish them silence. These types of rituals negotiate the lessons of history and coheres communal memory by welcoming people to revisit and experience an unresolved, unforgiven past. Continually offers the possibility for alternative points of view. These types of rituals question our colonial present, experiment with potential resolutions, and provide possibilities to break from ongoing systemic oppression. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang. We are indeed expanding the horizon of comfort women studies through this conference, right? After listening to 3 presentations already, you know, I'm getting very, very excited with what the group is going to achieve as serious scholars in respective fields in order to make important contributions to comfort women studies. And Professor Hwang's research with a focus on good shamanistic ritual in order to find solace, in order to express political disobedience as a tool to achieve healing and you know, the tenacity, the tenacious spirit where resilience is a very important manifestation. So all that, you know, I found her analysis absolutely fantastic. One thing that came to my mind though was that, you know, like, can we add one more perspective to analyze shamanistic ritual for April 3 and comfort women good? That is ontological resistance of the ghosts through the rituals practiced and staged by the shamans. That is, you know, when you think about, I know very little about this folklore tradition, often the subject of contempt and as well as fear. You know, Koreans are afraid of shamans, but at the same time, they hold them in contempt. You know, we all know that it's a pre-modern practice, but we all, at the same time, we all are very aware of the fact that it's still very up and about by looking at the interesting unfoldings of arguments regarding last presidential election, you know. So let me go back to this another variable that I could think of by listening to her presentation. That was, you know, Professor Hwang talked about Madanguk, you know, which is basically a staged mask dance. It's an expression of resistance, I think, resistance by the powerless people in order to mock and ridicule the powerful. That was their way, acceptable way to vent, and that was a socially acceptable stage to express their grievances. And when we look at good as a medium. It's the same mechanism, but the primary agency is the deceased. In other words, the dead refuse to die and go away. Why? Because the way they died was just so unjust. They cannot accept the death as their status quo, and they keep on fighting. And I see it as a very salient method to stage and engage in resistance. And how powerful is that? You know, we often think that when we kill somebody, the person goes away. But in this case, the dead refuse to die, you know, and the shamanistic ritual allows that kind of ontological existence. And by looking at the concepts in the subtitle, you know, I thought having one more concept such as resistance would be very helpful in order to better contextualize, you know, why do we still have this good practice, which is very pretty modern, which is often condemned as a practice of the powerless and the ignorant, you know. So that thought came to my mind by listening to Professor Huang's fantastic presentation. And let's move on to Dr. Gina Kwon and Ms. Kim Myung-hee. And they're going to, I think, compare the lived experiences in terms of a geographical journey and a temporal comparison between North Korean refugee women and comfort women. And the title is Tracing the Footsteps of Victimized Korean Women in Different Time Periods.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Gina, and with Myung-hee 선생님, as I always call her, we will present on the tracing the footsteps of victimized Korean women in different time periods. Well, I didn't really prepare anything to introduce ourselves in the beginning, but I thought maybe I need to make a brief introduction. So I was also very much influenced by the post-colonial theology. I think that was really ground of all my study that led me to do the sociology, international law, and human rights, all the way up to development studies I currently do now. And for the last 10 years, I've been working in the North Korean human rights area, working with a lot of NGOs. I have been basically 깍두기 as a standby person who goes after the NGOs whenever they need any help while working on my thesis and doing the ethnography approach. And while I was, I've been just working on the North Korean women. I had like few chances of working on the comfort women issue as a translator, or just out of my interest in East Asian courses, and well, so I didn't really have any expertise in this topic. So when Dr. Karanzako asked me whether I would be interested in this joining this conference, I was trying to make a linkage of my context and thus. So I was thinking of my interview that I had in China to the North Korean refugee women, which I conducted in 2012 and 2016. And while I was interviewing the North Korean women, at some point, there was an epiphany. I'm not really sure if I can call it that way, but there was a moment that I actually realized that history repeats. Meeting these women in China, hearing of their path all the way from North Korea to the area, to the small town that I visited, and hearing their detailed stories that they had to go through, I realized that their stories are were quite similar to the ones that I read from the testimonies of the comfort women in the school. So I just had that moment in my mind and just got back to Korea, working in NGOs, working on my thesis. And when Dr. Karanzako told me whether I would like to join in, I thought maybe I should bring that moment out. So while I was preparing for the presentation, with that moment, I came to know Yoon 선생님, who is in my research institute. She actually had personal yearning to work on this topic with her experience in North Korea and China and all the way to here. And so I shared my agenda, and she agreed, and she actually brought so many points as well. So we decided to work together, and working on the victimized or surviving experiences of North Korean women as well as comfort women, comparing that to the comfort women, and also ask questions to the comfort women experts, since I'm just a novice here. So the main methodology that we used was based on the testimonies that I collected from my studies, as well as the experiences that Yoon 선생님 had, along with her sister's experience and her friend's experience and my friend's experience. So based on those testimonies and experiences, we decided to use the existing testimonies that we could find from the books, not only because of the time limitation, but because we are novice in this area. We thought it may bring the ethical issues if we just try to jump into interview 할머니es. So we just went back to the books and tried to compare the experiences of these two groups of women. So Yoon 선생님 will come and she will start on the first commonality components of women.
Hello. 영어가 좀 약하고 발음 이상하시면 잘 들어주시면 감사하겠습니다. Thank you. I will start with the historical background, both of comfort women and North Korean refugees women in China have tons of history as a background. Comfort women has a background of 1930s when Japanese arms was entering to the ASEAN continent. That was the times when Japan was trying to exterminate Korean culture. In 1932 and 1934, Copper Station was established in Shanghai and Manchuria. Meanwhile, the highest number of the North Korean refugees women left North Korea in the middle 1990s during the Great Famine. During that times, about 330,000 people died of hunger and disease. And all of my friends, the kind of times disease, I look at my experience. And then among those who left North Korea, 72% of the North Korean refugees are women. And then next slide. Thank you. And then these two groups of the women have commonalities in society, economy, class. First, the education. So from my research, and so couple women went from royal society, economic class with royal education. Out of the 66 people in the book, in highest number of comfort women were not educated or premier activity the primary schools. Similar surveys on North Korean. Next slide. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, it continues. Similarly, survey on North Korean refugees show that the data, so that 26% of the North Korean refugees never attended school, regardless of those when this is 무료 교육, yes, mandatory education system in North Korea. Yeah, but they just didn't attend to those schools of those 26%. And such sentence also and that is continuous. Such sentence is also reflected in socio-economic class of North Korean refugees in this slide. As you can see, the majority of the North Korean refugees were from the middle class when they were in North Korea. People like laborers and public service workers and farmers are considered the middle class in North Korea. Considering those highest proportions of the North Koreans leave the country due to food shortage, also show there's a lot of North Korean people who live their hometowns country are not from those well-off groups. That data is a little different. 최근에 데이터가 조금씩 바뀌긴 하지만 그래도 가장 많은 부분이 just Hungary. Yeah.
So
okay.
There has been some changes in the recent data, but that's that the pattern of the data has been ongoing.
Thank you.
Okay. So following 명희 선생님's presentation, another commonality point, common components that we found was the way that women were mobilized and how the brokers were functioning and who were the brokers. So this table was made by 명희 선생님. So while the women were mobilized as comfort women or as being trafficked to China, there were components of violence, abduction, arrest, and here, as we can see, a large proportion of women experienced the employment fraud that led to the trafficking experiences. And here, this is the table that I just copied and pasted from my thesis. So here, as we can see, the way that women were North Korean women were being sent to China. Most of the women were trafficked, bundled with the deceit, lies of the people for economic gains that they would empty promise basically they would have in China if they leave if they follow the brokers, and these brokers were as well as the case of the comfort women were the ones in the local community, neighbors, sometimes families. And this is the trajectories of the migration path. As many of you will be familiar with, the left side is the location of the comfort station going around in China, and the right side one is the trajectories of the migration path, which 명희 선생님 and I drew based on the testimonies that we have. And though the path is not exactly overlapping, I think there is still some similar patterns that we can see all the way from North Korea, since we are dealing on the North Korea, to China here, and that was basically the moment that I actually realized that history repeats with the time gain, with the time flow, and yes, and for the
Yes. So another common component is deception. As Yoni Bak said that a man who looks in his 40s ages approached me and talked to me. He said he came from the Gangdong and said it is a very good place, and just like the rumors he said, go to Bears, you can earn good money and wear good clothes, anything. Yeah.
And similar testimonies were also found from North Korean women, as I said, from the above table, with the economic gain promises and meeting the husbands. But these were all lies, as many women found out.
Yeah. And then violence is also an important element. As Sun Ha said, after a year in Shanghai, I ran out of the comfort station in the snow, and then not having anywhere to go. So I went back to the kitchen in the comfort station. The manager, it's manager anyway. The manager hit me hard, calling me a bitch for runaway. I painted as my head blade too much. Yeah. Also, Dalion Sim said that when he screams, I have to go right now, unless he throws a knife he brings and stuck in my top.
The similar testimonies from North Korean women. The domestic violence was the common factor that I could find as I was interviewing women. And one woman who I interviewed, she shared me her experience being beaten so hard during her pregnancy by her husband that she could not even urinate for 4 days, and her body was all swollen.
After violence trauma experience equally applied to both groups of women. I was afraid people will recognize me as a corporate woman. So I moved from the one to the other place. And then other people said there were women who even say she cannot watch televisions if there is violent scenes due to the whole trauma.
For the slide. And the similar testimonies were also found from the North Korean refugee women. So there were many cases where North Korean women, when I asked them whether they would be interested in going to South Korea, even when they have options, they were not able to do so because the traumatic experience that they had really prevented them to go anywhere. And one here, as this testimony here says, one woman even told me that she couldn't even concentrate in her work in China because of the traumatic experience that she was chased by the police officials in China.
Yeah. And then sense of giving up is another component. Such scenes could be skins from the Sunihanism testimony. It's my fate. I made a wrong word and it is my fate. I do not say Japanese was bad. How could I run away to kill myself? I cannot run away. If I run away, they will just shut me at once.
Similarly, resignation, giving up, sense of the giving up was commonly found from North Korean women, especially to those who are ending up to stay in China, even though many said that they are in peace, where they now find their meaning of life in China. Certainly they had the resignation process. They had to just give in to the context that they had to deal with.
Yeah, a space of restriction was also found from both of the group. This space was also a space of violence in many cases. In case of comfort women's, violence space like Lin's copper station, tent, also the greenhouse a lot, and the alum separated by the split wood plates were all space of restrictions. In those spaces, soldiers will line up from 9 o'clock after 6 in the evening. People in the high ranks would commence. Some people left after asleep. They just it usually took 10 to 20 minutes for each person without any break. Comfort moments used to be late from 10 a.m. to 11 midnight. Sometimes it lasted the whole night. 10 to or 20 people raped women every day. Yeah.
Okay, because of the time limit, I will just make everything short. So similarly, space of restriction takes place in among North Korean women, along with the experiences of coming when women come back home, both in both of the groups, they found that they were not able to find their families and coming back to the empty hometown, and yet there were common wills that we could find to overcome the victimized experiences from both of the groups. The differences, to make it everything very short, regardless of the commonalities that we focused on for this presentation, there were certainly differences that we could make, like people in North Korean women had relatively wider spaces of restriction because still they are, and their restrictions, their space of the restrictions were basically socioeconomic restrictions, and they also had the existence of the they also have the space of solace. As I met these women through underground churches, churches actually functioned as a space of solace for many North Korean women, and some were still able to had a contact with their families, and also possibility of going to South Korea. Well, one of the women I met, she says she wants to go to South Korea and tell me that the reason that she wants to go to South Korea is not because she wants to live there, but because it's the same nation, 민족. So basically it's the story of the Korean women in the different time periods, taking with the similar components of the experiences taking place. And I have these questions that I also wanted to ask you while that I have been asking to NGO workers recently here whether it would be possible to collaborate act together on these women's issues, and also nationalism, how the nationalism works differently in these two different groups of women, and also the question of why we actually found out there are different depths of testimonies and interviews among women, and so why is it taking place, and what are the different costs of revealing the experiences. So yeah, I will have to just wrap it up here, and thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kwon is a good colleague of mine, and as I understand it, this presentation is still a work in progress. So with that caveat, I just like to add a couple of observations. That is, is the comparison between comfort women and North Korean women refugees stand a very careful dissections in terms of their differences and similarities. You know, when we just use one theoretical concept, that is androcentric patriarchy, as the root cause of their shared experiences is going to explain away most of the things that you have described. But we still have to be careful, and we should pay gingerly. We should sensitive analysis of these two groups, because they are not, I mean, respectively homogeneous groups. You know, North Korean women refugees, we just cannot say that, you know, like, oh, you know, through their perilous journey, upon departure from North Korea, you know, they were sexually exploited and abused and violated and all that. But, you know, before making really like big arguments about their experiences, we need to carve them out very, very carefully. They deserve very sensitive treatment, you know. So there are like details that I like to provide you with for your revisions, and I'll try to do that after this conference, because Dr. Kwon is a good colleague of mine, and as she makes progress with Ms. Kim Myung Hee, I'll try to make myself available in order to be helpful as the chair of today's session. Okay, let's move on to Professor Nusta Karanzako, and my apologies that, you know, I previously addressed her as Professor Karanja, which I had never done through our, you know, long friendship. I always call her Nusta, but somehow, you know, I was calling her by her middle name. So here we have Professor Nusta Ko, and she's going to talk about children. She's going to analyze comfort women issue from children's rights perspective. Okay, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Nusta Karanzako. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. Today, what I wanted to present to you is a topic perhaps that has gotten less attention compared to the other angles that we have seen regarding comfort women. The title goes, what about the children? The children's side of the argument on comfort women. So just to give you a context as to what it is that I am actually talking about, I think it's important to look at the statue. So this is a statue of the comfort girl statue in Berlin, Germany. So this is a symbolism regarding the atrocities that took place. It's a girl that is sitting down wearing a Korean traditional clothing called hanbok, and she's sitting there and just looking forward towards the other side. So I want to focus on the girls. It's very interesting because in terms of when we think about memorialization efforts and these kinds of statues that we have seen both in Berlin, United States, and also in Korea, we often see that they are girls. In other words, that it's not comfort to women only, but that we're actually looking at girls. But nonetheless, the focus has been quite less as much as looking at other aspects of the comfort women issue. So I'm going to try to look at the vantage point of comfort girls. So what I'm going to try to do with this presentation is give you a little bit of insight as to how I was able to weave archival research, testimonies from Korean victims, and normative markers from international human rights law on children's rights to explain how and why the sexual violence committed against comfort women, especially comfort girls, or comfort girls - women, to borrow the terminology that was used by Angela Son and also acknowledged by Margaret Steds, and how that needs to be understood within the framework of children's rights and not only women's rights violations. So basically, it's going to be more of a normative type of presentation, and critically unpacking this atrocity in terms of children's rights actually highlights the gravity of the crime that accompanied these children, if you will, these girls in the transportation that they had, the enforced relocation and enforced sexual slavery, among other things. Just some of the standards that I'm going to be discussing in today's presentations includes, for instance, the International Convention on the Rights, the International Convention of the Suppression of the Traffic in Women and Children, the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child, the International Labor Organization's Minimum Wage Convention, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So all those different normative standards that we currently have established, in addition to historic ones, are also going to be examined to basically elucidate the gravity of the crimes committed against girls or children, which helps pointing out the fallacy of the argument against comfort women that has recently come up, and the mischaracterization and a very controversial perspective that has also emerged in academic circles, in certain academic circles, I will say, in terms of the comfort woman issue. So what am I talking about when I talk about the controversies that have existed? I'm talking about this particular man, right? Professor J. Mark Ramsayer, and his wrongful and unsubstantiated claim about comfort women and girls. The argument based on children's rights basically debunks any argument he's trying to make, which is why it's even more important. So it doesn't even let you get to the point of his argument of arguing on the basis of contracts or any kind of things that he argues has been the case of comfort women. So by basically examining this case as a comfort girls violation, you're debunking the basis of his entire argument, which is why it's really, really necessary to look at this from the perspective of children's rights. So again, I think it's important to acknowledge where we are situating this. So comfort girls - women, that's actually a terminology that was used by Angela Son and also discussed by Margaret Stead. But it's also, it's interesting because the existence of girls in scholarship regarding comfort women or comfort station atrocities has pre-existed. In other words, they have been present. It's just that they have been brought together in terms of an analysis and examining this case primarily as one that involves war crimes and also one that involves women's rights violations and sexual slavery, among other things. But there has been a less of an emphasis in looking at this case primarily as one that represents the girls or the children's rights violations. So I think it's important that we think about this a little bit further normatively and in two ways. So what I'm going to try to do is first present the legally binding argument, right? This is the argument that actually matters, perhaps, if you will, if you're going to be counter-arguing as to what it is that I'm trying to propose in terms of the argument that can be made at the international level. So when we look at the legally binding argument, there's only one document or piece of evidence that comes to mind, and you also have to take into the context of the historic period in which we are actually looking at, and that is the 1921 International Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Women and Children. So the convention focuses on establishing international norms for the suppression of traffic, prosecution of those involved in trafficking children of both sexes, and the rectification of regulations of employment to ensure the protection of women and children seeking employment in another country. Specifically about employment, the convention refers to the standards outlined in the 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic, which is a very important point to note, which specifies, if you go to that international convention, again, the 1910 one, how those who contract, lead way, or procure employment, even with the consent of the person that is employed, a woman or underage, may be punishable and can be prosecuted. So again, I would read that part just one more time. So basically, the convention that refers to the standards outlined in the 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic specified how those who contract, lead way, or procure employment, even with the consent of the said woman, if it involves a woman or girl underage, may be punishable and can be prosecuted. So again, this is a standard that already existed at that time. And I'm going to note the fact, obviously in a little bit, the fact that Japan was a signatory to the convention and some of the little tricks that it actually tried to do to try to avoid the possibility of being held normatively accountable for what it had actually done. So in more simple terms, basically, the sole attempt of employing a minor, which is the argument that Mark Ramsayer and others have actually made who support that argument, is in effect, particularly involving girls underage, is sufficient grounds to constitute a violation of the norms of the convention. Additionally, if the employment of a minor was for immoral purposes, which sexual slavery clearly is for immoral purposes, then that constitutes a punishable offense. So basically all the standards outlined according to the 1921 International Convention, in addition to the standards that are outlined and that it refers to, the 1910 Convention basically makes Japan punishable. However, and here is the interesting part, Japan actually declared a reservation when it was acceding to the convention, noting that these territories of Chosen, that's what they called it, which was actually Japan's reference to Joseon, which was the long-lived imperial dynasty of Korea prior to Japan's occupation period. And so it basically excluded, or Japan declared a reservation saying Joseon, Taiwan, and the least territory of Guangdong, which is in the southern part of China, would be the ones that would be excluded from this convention being applicable. What is very unique is the fact that most of the women that were trafficked from Korea to China had to go through the northern route. In other words, the enforced disappearance or enforced or forced mobilization of these women for sexual purposes of these underage girls, which you can track through victims' testimonies that they were girls, was in violation of the convention and excluded from the original reservation clause that Japan attempted to say that it was basically shielded from. So what's very unique is that even though they try to come up with all these extra language to shield themselves from being held accountable, in reality, because of the type of trajectory that these victims actually had to cross through, again, northern China, the train route from Korea to China, this region is excluded from Japan's reservation clause, which only specifies Guangdong or southern China as being the one that actually mattered for the convention to not be applicable. In other words, other areas of China actually matter. In addition, what Japan forgot to emphasize is the fact that they had also trafficked girls from Korea in particular through Japan, inside Japan, but they never had actually mentioned in the reservation clause Japanese territory to be exempt from the convention's normative application. As a result, victims' testimonies that confirm the fact that they were trafficked inside Japan and also through northern China basically confirms the mere fact that legally binding argument that Japan was in violation of the convention. In other words, this is a point that can be argued in international court. Now, the legally non-binding yet symbolic argument here, I think is also important to take into consideration. And this concerns particularly the 1924 Geneva Declaration, which is basically the declaration that preceded the CRC, which is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the one that people most often refer to. We're talking about the 1924 Geneva Declaration, which is not a legally binding document. Generally, if it's a declaration, it's not legally binding. And Japan had also not ratified the ILO Minimum Age Convention and the Minimum Age Recommendation of 1932. Nevertheless, as these international instruments were one of the early attempts to codify a collective set of norms related to children's rights and were developed during the period of the Asia-Pacific War when comfort stations were set up there is merit to reviewing the extent to which conversations challenged children's rights. The Geneva Declaration in particular outlines several rights that ought to be protected for children. For instance, the right for children to be given the means for normal development, both materially and spiritually. And here, normal development refers to conditions where children are fed, nourished, helped, sheltered, in a way that it avoids them from being in a situation of hunger, sickness, delinquency, or orphanhood. So that's all important to emphasize, because from that vantage point, Japan's actions that jeopardize the lives of comfort girls, women, by subjecting them to sexual slavery in wartime represented a clear violation of children's rights that are enshrined in the Geneva Declaration of 1924. Again, a non-legally binding, however, symbolic argument to make. Under Article 2 of the Minimum Age Convention, children under 14 years of age or children over 14 years who are still required by national laws or regulations to attend primary school shall not be employed in any employment to which the convention applies except as hereinafter otherwise provided. By this definition, children under 14 or over 14 but protected by national law on obligations of education would therefore be exempt from work. In other words, we're referring to a clear violation that was done by Japan because there were girls that were also extremely young that were overemployed, and they also specify the hours of employment as well, and how that actually challenged the rights. So on the point regarding the Child Welfare Act of Japan, and this I wanted to bring in because I wanted to demonstrate the extent to which Japan also was recognizing certain frames of age as being exempt from being needing to work. The Japan Welfare Act, was instituted on December 12, 1947, a few years after the comfort girls and women category. And according to this act, they define, and I quote, a child as a person under 18 years of age. From this standard, girls working in conversations who were younger than 18 would therefore be categorized as a child. Additionally, the Labor Standard Act of Japan, which was enacted just around the same time in 1947, provides restriction on the working hours and on the work on rest days and the prohibition of night work and restrictions on engaging in dangerous and harmful jobs for a person under 18 years of age. And this is a very important point. And that's, again, something that is re-emphasized by the ILO Minimum Age Convention, where girls in conversation work more than 8 hours per day, and weekends were not an exception. And that's something that both the ILO Minimum Age Convention, again, not something that Japan signed on to or even acceded to or ratified, but nonetheless has a symbolic argument, in addition to the Child Welfare Act of Japan that actually emphasizes the legal age of basically children being able to work and how there are certain restrictions, thinking about that as it applies to the comfort girls case, if they were in clear violation. So here I'm actually providing a direct testimony from a victim, Moon Pil-gi's account, where she notes, and I quote, "From about 9 o'clock in the morning, soldiers began to arrive and form orderly lines. And from 6 o'clock in the evening, high-ranking officers came, some of whom stayed overnight. Each woman had to serve an average of 30 to 40 men a day, each day, And during the weekends, as Moon Pil-gi explained, roughly 40 to 50 soldiers would come and beginning at 8 o'clock in the morning. For this reason, some survivors have explained that Scary Sunday was a feared day." So that clearly goes against the notions of these established standards of what women, in this case, girls, would be subjected to work, which is more than 8 hours per day. And weekends were not an exception, again, violation of the norms that have been established at the international and also at the domestic level. One more point, which I think is really important to also emphasize, is the fact that the ILO Minimum Age Recommendation, which is related to the Minimum Age Convention, specifies and prohibits dangerous employment for children that might include employment in establishments for the cure of the sick, such as employment involving danger of contagion or infection. By working in comfort stations, the girls were subjected to dangerous employment. They were exposed to the possibility of sexually transmitted disease, in addition to enforced pregnancy and also termination of the fetus and other types of dangerous moments to their health. So a little bit more on the modern take, and this is a convention, obviously, that we all know when it comes to children's rights at the international level, which concerns the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I just want to point out just two aspects in how Japan's abuse of Korean comfort girls, in particular in comfort stations, would be a violation of the norms enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, by the way, a lot of these convention norms are actually customary international law, which basically are international customs that have predated the existence of the convention and that have been accepted as part of international human rights law. Article 34 states that state parties shall undertake to protect the child from all forms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. Blah, 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 coercion of a child to engage in any sexual or unlawful sexual activity. So the comfort station itself, the system and what it was trying to do was in violation of children's rights. Article 20, the same. The fact that they need to be protected and provided with their best interests, and that they need the special assistance because children are a vulnerable position or are at a vulnerable position by reason of their physical and mental immaturity and need special safeguards and care as noted by the CRC. All contracts with children, therefore, are illegal, even if there was a supposed consent. And I think this is the major pushback that we can do against those that have tried to defame or claim otherwise regarding what has taken place with comfort girls-women. Concluding thoughts, violations are clear, some are binding, legally binding, some are not. Normative arguments reveal the extent of the gravity of the crime, and re-examining the case as a children's rights violation may be more effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ko, for your thought-provoking analysis. Let me add two observations here. One is not directly related to the academic topics of comfort women. That is the rising phenomena of proxy history war engaged by third parties regarding comfort women studies. We get to see pro-Korea, pro-Japan, third party academics. They can be Germans, Australians, Americans, Canadians, you name it. And I think Ramsier incident is one of the manifestations of such phenomena, where pro-Japanese academic employed at a very prestigious university advocates his positionality, and despite the criticisms, he would not render his original position. Why? I personally think simply because he can. He can. And in order to go beyond that, we have Professor Ko looking at legal aspects. And let me add my thoughts here. Most of the international courts, human rights courts, do not have effective sanctioning mechanisms. Somebody can be tried for the violation of human rights, but somebody or sovereign state can be tried, but international human rights courts do not have the effective legal authority to exercise their sanctions. Okay, that's the general norm. So, given this law, various laws are coming starting with 1921 International Convention for the Suppression of the Trafficking of Women and Children, and ILO stipulations. We can all apply these laws to comfort women situations and their conditions. I would not say it's their working conditions, because I don't necessarily think that they were in sex trade. They were sexually exploited, but I don't think they were sex workers during wartime. And another thing that drew my attention was that things like descriptions like immoral process can be contested concept by Japan. I think I know the country fairly well. From the Japanese perspective, it was wartime. Japanese citizens themselves, they were dying in the name of the emperor. And in such historical milieu, historical and cultural milieu, their argument could be, serving at comfort station was not necessarily immoral. They would say it's external imposition of moral values on the society of Japan, and, we need to think about their rebuttal, and we need to think about our next strategy to fight their rebuttals, okay? Same thought applies to, 8 years of working age. Japanese government repeatedly has been saying, there was no underage girls. So we need to compile very convincing documents to fight against, their position, and working hours same. So where I'm getting at is, human rights discourse basically is very normative, idealistic. That's what we aspire for as the citizens of global community. But when it comes down to real actual application of those norms to specific cases, there are many loopholes that we need to think through very carefully. But again, Professor Ku's argument is very helpful because it takes us to a different dimension, which is legal interpretation application of the rights violated by Imperial Japan. Okay, let me stop my comment here, and it's almost like 11:32, and I know that we still have to go Q&A session, which will be facilitated by Professor Ko. But before I render my place to Professor Ko, let me add one thing. I have so much to say about Dr. Kwon and Ms. Kim's presentation. There was so much I wanted to say, and I just didn't think it was a good idea for me to go into details. Ideas you need to think through very carefully, especially when you discuss similarities. Starting from the root cause of North Korean women leaving their country, utterly inept governance on the part of the Pyongyang regime. When you apply the same logic to comfort women, we should hold Joseon Dynasty accountable for the women's victimization. Do you want to go there? We also need to think about geopolitics, which you didn't talk about. You just described the route of perilous journey. It's geopolitics. It's geopolitics. It doesn't change. You can say that's the similarity, but the geopolitics lens do not move. We just have to follow that route. And when you look at the battlefronts that Japan was engaging during the Asia-Pacific War, in Southeast Asia, Taiwan, all these areas, there has to be similarities, and you cannot make a strong argument out of that. That's what I personally think. Let me stop here because, after not saying much about your paper, I was feeling so bad. I almost fell sick to my stomach. So this is a way for me to redeem myself, okay? And Nusta, Professor Ko, the floor is yours.
Q&A session right now. If you have any questions, if you can please write it in the Q&A or bring it up in the chat, it would be greatly appreciated. At the moment, I'm not seeing any questions come up right away. In case the panelists want to ask each other questions or if there's discussion point, we can certainly start there. Yes, Dr. Stetz.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for these marvelous papers. I am absolutely thrilled to be here to listen to all of these. I wanted to add a couple of short footnotes to two of the presentations. Professor Pilzer, you had mentioned the fate of the former military sex slaves after liberation and the way in which some of them were channeled into sex work for occupation forces. And this is a very important point, and I'd like to give credit for the research into this to Professor Yuki Tanaka, to his 2001 book on Japan's comfort women, sexual slavery, and prostitution during World War II and the US occupation. And I'd especially like him to get that credit because when he published his research about the use of the former sex slaves by occupying troops, he was essentially hounded out of his position in Australia by right-wing groups that were very unhappy about these revelations and the documentation that he produced. So credit to Dr. Tanaka. And then I also wanted to say how much I was interested in the presentation by Professor Huang about shamanism. And just to mention something that I'm sure many of you do know already, the way in which the filmmaker and director Cho Jung-rae used this connection between shamanism and the former military sex slaves in the 2016 film Spirit's Homecoming, which ends with the performance by the young girl who is a shaman who is bringing the spirits of the dead former sex slaves back to their homeland in the form of a giant cloud of butterflies, and also reuniting the film's protagonist with her family, with her parents. So just one more support for that connection in a cultural object. Thank you, that's all I wanted to say.
Dr. Pilzer, do you want to respond by any chance?
Oh, just to say that, yeah, the Tanaka's work is fantastic. I think, and extremely groundbreaking in making those connections. I think a lot of that you can find in Catherine Moon's work, Sex Among Allies, that book about the Kijichan area around Seoul, and yeah, I think that the issue of that continuity, the continuity into post-war and indeed right up until the present, and actually kind of branching out in many different directions, right? Like you can branch out towards military sex work, but you can also branch out towards for occupying military forces, but you can also branch out to domestic militaries. Like I think in 1995 or something, around 70% of Korean men recorded that they had lost their virginity to a sex worker. And so there's absolutely massive, sex industry in South Korea, and a lot of the comfort women were funneled into that, as opposed to into something specifically for the Americans, which of course is another one which is extremely important. Some people went on to be like entertainers, I mean, some of the people who have been mentioned over the course of today, one of them went back to Daegu and became a well-known kiseng, which is professional female entertainer. Of course, the meaning of that term kiseng changes a lot over the course of the 20th century. But in any case, I think these continuities mean that the question is what remains is that, I mean, what remains is greater than maybe even what has even come before. I mean, I think that and to find ways to build those connections that we've been talking about, I think is extremely important. And I think that we're really, in a sense, just getting started, in making those, in the work that needs to be done. So thank you very much for your comment. I agree 100%.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I think we have, sorry, Dr. Huang.
Oh yeah, just a quick response to Dr. Stetz. Thank you for that, the pointing about the film Spirit's Homecoming. I haven't seen the film, but I've heard of it. And it does raise a question in my mind about the various types of films that have already been released around the comfort women issue. And the question that I have about, how we use films, different types of films for purposes of education or evidence, whether they be documentary films or narrative fiction films, how they play into our understanding of the issue is something that I think is unresolved. But thank you for bringing that up.
I see. Okay. Now I believe I see a hand from Dr. Jung Kim.
Thank you very much. It was really, I learned a lot from insightful presentations from speakers today. I have it's not a question, but maybe it's a question. I wonder, I'm a panelist from yesterday's session, and I think yesterday we were talking about, once all these survivors passed away, then how we are going to deal with reconciliation, right? So, having heard these engaging discussions about comfort women with visualized images from Professor Na-Young Lee and Professor Joshua Pilter and Professor Miros Huang's presentation, it really brings me this experience of being haunted by past comfort women. And when I see the images of past comfort women who already died, and when I hear the song sung by a former comfort woman who passed away from Professor Pilzer's presentation, and of course the shamanism rituals from Professor Miros Huang's presentation, it kind of inviting me to this affectionality that I feel like, they are here, the specters are here. So my question is somehow piggybacking what Professor Mi-kyung Kim was talking about, ontological resistance. So when I was in, participating in a human rights conference at Columbia University back in 2018, one of the European scholars were conducting ethnographic research in Cambodia. And in Cambodia, in Killing Field, the neighboring community people try not to go there during the nighttime because this becomes a ghost field. So the ghosts are walking around and they are feared by encountering those ghosts. And when I was asking this question to the presenter, so this transitional justice is for specters or not, they were taken aback and they said, this is not for the dead. This presentation is for the living people. Mm-hmm. So what I see is that there is a serious paradox in our academics, and we usually don't talk about whether we believe in ghosts or not. I think Derrida made the point in a really insightful point in Specters of Marx. And my question is about whether this kind of haunting can be a sociological imagination. I think Avery Gordon is talking about Ghost Matters, haunting as a sociological imagination, and it can be used as a transformative recognition of justice for us to think about what's ahead of our time in the future and beyond. So I wonder if Professor Na-Young Lee or Joshua Pilzer or Miros Huang can respond to my question whether, this distinction that we are talking about, I think ghosts are not either or. It is more about neither living nor dead, or both living and dead. So I wonder what is your perspective about the existence of ghosts as ontological resistance, or maybe ontological existence. I think it's kind of the question that Professor Mi-kyung Kim, already asked.
Can I respond to Dr. Kim?
Yes,
Very
Dr. Lee.
shortly? Actually, one of my paper published in 2012 was dealing with that kind of issue. So I totally agree with your perspective. So I feel like, I haven't been haunted. Without haunting, why I have been in the field of comfort woman and military prostitution instead of other very fancy subjective topics. Very successful, very, very accessible. So I feel always I'm haunted. Even on the street of a Wednesday demonstration, and also even in other field of women's activism, including good. I have been to the good places several times. So I have no clear response to your question or ideas, but I really agree with your basic idea about haunting issues. But let me make a very quick comment to Dr. Huang. Actually, the bird under the shoulder of the Peace Monument, gold statue, is also a symbol of the spirit, kind of spirit medium of a woman who died without words. So please, refer to that kind of a statue's image too.
That's a really great point.
Probably it resonates with 적동세. Are you familiar with this 적동세 myth coming from the Pyongan area in today's North Korea, which Kim So-wol made a poem out of? A girl murdered by her stepmother, and she would come to the windows of her younger brothers and cry at night. So even though she's murdered, she's not dead. She exists as a bird in order to tell her brothers that she is still there looking after them, So, Professor Lee's information somehow reminded me of 적동세, that folklore coming from the Pyongan area of today's North Korea.
Dr. Huang?
Yes, thank you. Great, amazing conversation and brilliant questions from Dr. Mi-kyung Kim and Jung-ha Kim. I am also, something I didn't mention was I'm also inspired by Toyin Omoyani Viola. He came up with this idea of ritual archive, where the archive of where rituals themselves, what is transmitted in the ritual, whether it's an affective transmission or verbal transmission, it itself becomes a real a dictating form of record that should be considered more seriously in our attempts to reach for justice, whether that's transformative justice or other forms of legal justice. And he's using certain cases, I think the Rwanda genocide particularly, in this consideration, but we could also look back to a lot of the issues that have still been unreconciled with various First Nations populations in the Americas, and how they also use other types of oral records in these ways. And then how do we mediate between the kind of modern justice systems that are not necessarily in concert with those indigenous forms of knowledge? And that's something that for us to really think about more seriously, and is one of the, I guess, unsaid desires that I have in pursuing this line of thinking around Kut as a form of resilience and restoration.
We have one question from the audience. I will read it so that everybody can hear it. It says, from Mary McCarthy at 10:49 a.m., she commented, I appreciated Dr. Lee's presentation of her positionality. No, I would actually concur with that. In this difficult subject matter, I feel that positionality is so important to acknowledge and reflect on as we conduct this type of scholarship. I was wondering how the other scholars, as well as Dr. Lee, feel about the advantages and disadvantages of their positionality. John, Dr. Pilzer, do you want to take aim?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's I thought this project when I started to do it, I thought it was completely going to be impossible, because of all of the things, gender, race, class, everything, language, even my Korean was urban, and the victim survivors, Korean was generally quite rural, and not just experience of war, experience of sexual violence, gender as a huge sticking point, obviously. So that whole book actually begins with like a preface, which is all about this issue of starting from ignorance, and the advantages and disadvantages of starting from ignorance. I think, and I tried to make it and turn a disadvantage into an advantage, since there's no point at which I could claim to understand anything or to share, in experience. Maybe our one point of contact was that we liked singing, but that was about it. And so it's been a very long and very transformative process for me in terms of understanding the whole genealogy of the objectification, commodification of women under colonialism and capitalism, and especially of colonial women, and the fetishization of East Asia as female, and of East Asian women as hypersexual or passive, and all that stuff, So it's been a very long process of digging myself out, and it's I would say that it's still, in my estimation, the understanding that I have gleaned is very shallow, but it's so much more than it was before, just in terms of understanding, women's experience of sexual violence in wartime. So that's basically what I can say about that. I maybe also, just the musical perspective was an advantage of a kind, because it was so unusual, and so to go to survivors and say, what is your favorite song, is a very different kind of question that than they had been being asked. Typically, all the other researchers were asking very extremely important questions in order to get a sense of the scope of the comfort women system, and so on. But it was in a sense like asking, what are your favorite things, and what would you like to, that you would like to show to other people, and so that, I think, and you also sing together, so you actually do end up doing things together in a way that you, when you talk back and forth at each other, So that kind of mingling of voices, and that was I think a really powerful aspect, I hope, of the project as well.
Maybe we'll get one more response if there's anyone else that would like to comment. Yes, Dr. Han.
I think that question of positionality is so important. It's something that we need to really think about, I think, as we launch into any project. And I regret that I didn't actually do that in the beginning of my presentation. But if I could do it now, it's something that I think, especially as we think about how which arenas really drive the movement forward and what kinds of privileges people in those arenas have, I think we need to think about this quite seriously. If as a second generation Korean American woman, cis woman, I think that I have incredible amounts of privilege, but my interest in this direction of thinking about the legacies of the Cold War and the ongoing traumas of the middle 20th century, it is sparked by my my wondering about the types of traumas that my grandmother and my parents had, and the kind of intergenerational transmission of those traumas to us, and what connections we have as settlers here, of these unceded territories, have to work on issues that are for Koreans in Korea and internationally. It's something that I am continuing to think about. But the part of it that I'm quite dissatisfied with is that as a historian, oftentimes we don't close that circle. We don't go back to those communities and ask them to tell us whether or not they, this is the kind of information that they want. And we're so locked in our libraries and our books that we don't think about those things. And I think that is definitely a type of injustice, a kind of intellectual injustice that we really need to be attendant to.
Thank you so much. I think I'm looking at the time. Dr. Lee, would you want to make one final comment? Because you're the one who started out with positionality.
Yeah, actually, advantage is to access women, including activists, victim survivors, and other experts in daily basis. My doctoral research was about U.S. military prostitution. It's been 20 years almost when I entered the field, but I have never left the field. I have kept conversation with them, and also I always supported them, and I always encouraged them to even sue against the Korean government. And also I am a strong supporter to make a kind of museum, small museum, and comfort women. I mean, not comfort women, the U.S. comfort women, U.S. military comfort women. So it's very, very big advantage for me, but that is also disadvantages because I feel like a lot of burden and responsibility to realize the justice for various kind of victim survivors in various fields, because I have have been involved in different kind of field of activism, and I have been even in their personal lives. So it's very hard to write a paper, very hard to analyze their daily lives. So I think that is a disadvantage as a scholar. So it is very hard to keep balance between activist and scholar. So that's why I said, it is kind of a continuum of insider and outsider.
Any other comment related to that question? I just wanted to say, Dr. Lee, we really appreciate you mentioning this about positionality. It's something that, often comes up also in Indigenous studies research. And, there's a lot of that kind of discussion, but it's actually quite lacking, at least in my field. And I'm sure Dr. Mi-kyung Kim can relate in international relations or any kind of conferences like that. So I thank you so much for bringing that in. I know we are kind of, going towards the end of our conference time, but there is a question, and I do want to acknowledge that the question has been acknowledged by the anonymous attendee that has asked the question at 10:57 a.m. How is the international system and even civil society going to deal with sexual slavery in war times? Because even now, these things are still happening. For instance, in some war-torn parts of the world, women suffer in the hands of war perpetrators and those that claim to be helping in ending the war.
May I take on that?
Yes, absolutely.
One of the ways to end such violence against women, either wartime or peacetime, is to stop objectifying women. Women are not the objects of exercise of power, control, domination, exploitation. Women should be perceived as inherently respectful existence, human beings. And, this is very closely related to human rights principles. Every individual is born with inherent dignity, where women cannot be an exception to this. As I have mentioned before, human rights norms are very idealistic and very visionary. It's very normative, but we have been moving towards that direction, because that's one of the ways for us to redeem ourselves from our past wrongs and to save ourselves from innate propensity to commit violence. So, during wartime, look at Ukraine. Look at what's happening to the women in Ukraine. Women symbolizes something to the perpetrators with very specific goals in their mind. That is subjugation, control, making a declaration that the land is claimed and the land belongs to them. So, given all these symbolic messages, as well as a brutal manifestation in reality, which is expressed in rape and other forms of sexual violence, we should stay mindful. And the starting point is to see women as valuable beings who is entitled to the same protection as men, the perpetrators and the powerful, however you define the positionalities, we gotta start somewhere. And that's my 2 cents.
I think that there's another issue that this question brings up is, how do we limit war in a way that is supposed to target what we're intending it to target? I mean, war shouldn't exist at all, but when it does, there are all of these other kind of collateral damage that occur to women, to children, but to not just infrastructures, but to the environment, etc. And how do we rein that in when there is militarized conflict? Education would be great, but I don't know if it's worked so far in keeping us from perpetrating militarized violence. So I think at the root of it is trying to figure out a different, incredibly revolutionary way of thinking about how to coexist.
Yes, Dr. Lee.
Oh, I have a different kind of comments. So, Dr. Fisher, you have related issues?
I can circle back around. Please go ahead.
So may I raise a question or
Yes,
comment?
yes.
Yeah, okay. First of all, toward Dr. Go. So your argument and analysis very, very important, particularly against the historical revisionist right now. But I'm wondering, if you have been have a conversation with the Korean scholars or Japanese scholars regarding that issues, the kind of, for example, Jung Jin-sung, or law scholars like Kim Chang-nok, or international law scholars in Korea and Japan. So they have already dealt with that issues many times. So what is the difference between yours and other people, previous one? And second one, toward Dr. Piercer, I'm wondering, have you heard about Arirang-bi in Miyakojima in Okinawa? Yeah, and I've been there twice. It was very touching. The people in Miyakojima, Japanese people, remembered the Korean Kung Fu Woman's Arirang song, and they sang a song, and that's why the Korean Council and Japanese women to support them to build a statue, the memorial statue. So I think that the song from the Kung Fu Woman is not, I mean, you are dealing with the post-war, post-colonial period, but why don't you deal with the, colonial period or other reasons? So I'm just wondering, and you are familiar with that kind of issues.
Dr. Pilzer, do you want to take that first, or should I go ahead? What would you prefer?
I can go, I guess. So I'll tell you a story. So when I went to, basically the reason that I haven't spent, I do actually have an article about music in the Comfort Station, and also the patterned recruitment from the Konbon and other places that have the entertainment connection, but now my story. So I was in the middle of making this big anthology, and a radio producer from NBC Radio came to visit and asked me and some of the women who I had recorded if they could use the songs for radio documentary, and so we agreed that they could. And then the radio documentary, it was in two parts, and one part was about before the war, and one part was about experiences during the war, and there was nothing after that. So basically, my preoccupation with the post-war, for one thing, it has to do with my preoccupation with it's not preoccupation with the post-war, it's preoccupation with the living people who I and you are working with. So, and I think that's a little bit different, right? So if you in the book, for instance, it tells three people's stories, and it goes from it's the whole story as they told it to me and to others. So I'm not particularly uninterested in anything that happened before 1945. I think that's very much an important part of the story, but I feel like it gets emphasized to the extent that this is the centering the survivors issue, and centering even experiences of victimization. Traumatic experience is a very long thing, and it never goes away. It's like back to the ghosting idea that we were talking about. All of these people are haunted to one degree or another. Comfort women themselves. I remember being in Pakduri's room and we burned gochu, right, dried hot peppers to get rid of ghosts, and all these things that people would do to get rid of ghosts, you know. But the focus on changing the perspective, maybe also something coming from my positionality, from thinking of comfort women as a historical issue and thinking of comfort women victim survivors as teachers who I needed to learn from, I guess, and that planted me kind of very much in the present, you know. The wartime repertoire is absolutely fascinating and amazing, and a lot of people, you know, remember a lot of songs from their childhood. I was thinking about that all through Dr. Ko's presentation. You know, how many songs are sung from the perspective of girls leaving their mothers and leaving their hometowns. And anyway, so I'm very interested in that. So, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to mention that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pilzer. There's a question from the anonymous attendee that I think is related to what Dr. Lee had asked me regarding my research or study that have been examining children's rights. It's interesting, Dr. Lee, because most of the published research that engages in any form of legal analysis regarding what has actually taken place or how to legally try to debunk or try to refute revisionist arguments never really pinpoint children or girls. So I think that's the niche that I'm trying to contribute to, right? There's a lot of reference to the International Convention on the Trafficking, blah, blah, but there's no unpacking as to what that actually entails. Why is that problematic? What were the reservation clauses? How is it not valid? So all those ideas are mentioned in passing, but never really truly unpacked. In addition, I don't believe any of the published research has engaged in anything related to the ILO convention and the minimum age standards that have been established, which is interesting because I was, you know, that you see the memorialization that take place with the statue. It's a girl. So, and you know, I've read a lot of Dr. Margaret Stett's work and Angela Son, and that continues becoming, you know, I guess, focused over and over again. And I think maybe talking a little bit about my positionality, a lot of my work involving, because I do a lot of cross-regional work, also involving Peru, deal a lot with coercive sterilization victims and things like that. So I've been very much focused on women's rights as well, but I had never thought about, right, within women, there's girls, and the adult, I think they call it adultification of the crime, right? Where thereby, because you adultify a crime that is committed to a minor, you make it seem like it's something else or treat it in a different way. And so looking at that and bringing that angle back into the comfort woman case, I think that's how I began my research. One final point, I began my research because I was angry. And I think anger always helps because of this revisionist movement. And if Professor Byung-Gap Min was actually here, he would probably go on and on about Mark Ramsay and this and that. But I think that was my motivating factor. It's always been a motivating factor for both of my research that I do on Peru and also in South Korea. But yes, that helped me a great deal. So I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but I can tell you that that's not an angle that has been explored even within the legal or analysis. Now, whether or not that actually has legally binding or to which extent it can actually be carried through in terms of, you know, thinking about international human rights norms as, you know, I don't know. But nonetheless, existing or having international human rights norms is still better than not having it. And that goes to Beth Simmons' research regarding the importance of international treaty ratification, existence within the international system. Dr. Huang?
I have a follow-up question to that, Professor Ko. I was really, when I first learned about the Japanese signing the 1921 International Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking in Women and Children with the clause that exempted Korea, Taiwan, Guangdong, I was kind of baffled at how that could even be legally binding. But then I also thought about a question about legal minorities. So if, because children are not able to self-represent, how does that impact then the ability for these types of very inhumane laws and conventions to be practiced.
Yeah, so I think that's there's a lot of complications, right? Even though the fact that I have mentioned that children's rights have generally been originally it started out more as a customary international law, but up until the Geneva Declaration regarding children's rights, there wasn't actually an official document where children were acknowledged as a separate group necessitating some form of human rights protection. And we can argue that about women as well and CEDAW and things like that. But nonetheless, that's why it's like embedded in those standards, right? The Minimum Age Convention indirectly mentions, the age. It's not very, very distinct and clear and direct, but they indirectly mention if they are kids that are studying, then they would not be able to work in dangerous employment, because back then child labor was also not only obviously restricted to wartime, but in other areas as well. But they indirectly kind of mention those things to try to, in a way, set some level of standard, but not at the same time make it too obvious so that countries can also get away with doing a lot of the things that they were doing at that time. So I think that the intricacies of trying to unpack those tiny little standards is where I think a lot of the victims' testimonies become very useful in being able to situate the fact. And I think Dr. Pilzer was mentioning about the songs and how it talks a lot about the girls, et cetera, and the testimonies that confirm the fact of how old they were and how young they were. And I think Professor Byung-Gap Min yesterday was mentioning the median age to be 11 for a comfort girl. So I think all that needs to be taken in together to make the argument regarding the violations that have taken place. But what makes the situation very unique is the fact that Japan had that reservation clause, which basically shields them from certain level of, I guess, crime making in the specific areas that they had mentioned. But it's interesting because they have not been shielded from other areas where those possible crimes have been committed, although the argument obviously, unfortunately, falls into like, oh, it was wartime. But it doesn't matter, even during times of war, certain standards of international human rights still, and humanitarian law, if I may, also continue to apply, which is the reason why I thought it was important. I'm trying to see if there's any more questions. I don't believe we have any more questions, and I know that in Korea or in Japan, the time is very late. So I hope you have been able to have a little bit of coffee. Originally, Dr. Sasha Sheehan was supposed to give his closing remarks today, but instead, unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, I will be subbing in. So this is me. You continue to get me. My apologies. So let me provide the closing remarks regarding our conference. Thank you to the presenters and the chair, Dr. Mi-kyung Kim, who has been a mentor for me in many different ways. Today's presentation centered on victims' voices and stories truly made it clear why it is that we do the work we do, again, as academics, scholars, and activists, as Dr. Na-young Lee has mentioned. The marginalization, exclusion, and discrimination that these women and girls suffered is one that questions the basic meaning of humanity and how we have come this far in committing and accepting such atrocities. Together with what has been discussed yesterday, I'm left wondering of many things, one of which was asked by an audience member, Dr. or Professor Boram Lee from the University of Baltimore, of who owns comfort women or the issue of comfort women or their stories. These victims and survivors are owners of their own stories, which are complicated by the intersections of politics and power struggles that have been imposed on their identities and stories and histories. In addition, the meaning of apology, which is something that was also discussed, what that constitutes, why it is important, and why it is simply not possible to accept a one-time apology has to be made understood to the public and society. In other words, a deeper exploration of symbolic reparations. The meaning of commemoration and memorialization may be needed. Finally, I ask, what more can there be done? And revising this question based on today's last minute talks. What about the ghosts of the past, present, and futures? Thank you once again to the presenters, Dr. Kim, Dr. Lee, Dr. Kim, PhD candidate Myung-hee Kim, Dr. Hwang, Dr. Pilzer, and our IT team for all their work and help in making day 2 of this conference possible. And finally, thank you to the Academy of Korean Studies for their support in organizing this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.